Happy New Year to you all. You might notice something a little bit new about me. That's right, I started using a new moisturizer. Also, I have COVID, which is why this lecture maybe will sound a little bit phlegmy. Last month, I was truly considering making drugs the final topic that we covered. But in a last-ditch effort to stem the gaping wound of time and money that is this project, we began charging for subscriptions. And hey, what do you know? Y'all stepped up. So, thanks to each of you who subscribed. You quite literally power this project, helping to democratize and make much more accessible public forum debate. Y'all are my heroes. Now, for those of you not financially gifted enough to become my hero, I still want you to be able to access these materials if you need them. If you truly cannot afford the $5 a month, just shoot me an email and I'll send them over to you. However, these pro bono subscriptions will not exceed the paid ones, so please only ask if you truly can't afford them. To those of you who are curious, the Boss plan at $10 a month also includes the best PF course and likely the best debate course currently available. It's totally self-guided, totally complete, mostly complete. If your team or partner or coach isn't giving you the wins you'd like to be racking up, I highly recommend this course. So far, I've gotten feedback from only one person, but it has been good feedback. A few other quick notes. I've just started a coding bootcamp, which nearly delayed the release of this topic video, and it may well damper the speed of the next couple of releases as well. However, I'll try to put the briefs out at least within 5 days of the topic release, so if having these lectures and briefs ASAP is a priority to you, if you want to have these briefs like 2 days after the topic is released. I'm not going to have them that soon, but I will have them 5 days after the release. I recommend following our Instagram for updates if it matters to you. If you don't get to the topics until 2 weeks after the release, kind of a moot point, doesn't matter. Next, much of the research and most of the brief from this month's topic was done by Krish Mawalkar. I'll link his Instagram below if you want to give him a holler or a quick thanks. You'll notice 2 things about the brief from Mr. Krish. It's slightly different format from my briefs. He uses verbatim and I don't. And it is also a higher quality of brief. He's provided groupings that enable contention building in a way that mine generally do not. I hope this quest towards making the briefs better will continue indefinitely. Please give me feedback on the briefs so we can continue this quest together. Finally, a couple quick notes to subscribers of the briefs. One, as usual, there's a rebuttal sheet on the website alongside the evidence, but now that you are paying for it, if there are arguments I didn't cover in the sheet, just let me know, shoot me an email or a comment, and I'd be happy to provide some analytical rebuttals for these arguments. If there's any arguments you're like, what, how can I do a rebuttal? I can just let me know. I'll give them to you in the, there. Next, apparently most of you didn't get Discord invites. So last night I sent out a link to all the subscribers. You should come join. It's a party. It might be a party. Also, if any of you know how to set up Discord rooms, please help because it's kind of lame right now. Oh, and subscribe to the channel. So, after several days researching this topic, I have come to the conclusion that the arguments presented in this lecture, anyway, are not overly complicated. They are just based on a complex interaction of actors and interests, as you see by these bubbles. I've chosen 5 of the involved parties. These are the 5 bubbles. To discuss, although there could be 10 other bubbles easily. And we'll see very soon why it becomes so complex when we're talking about Turkey. But before we get to any of that, let us begin with a discussion of the resolution and each of the constituent words. The resolution, on balance, Turkey's membership is beneficial to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise known as NATO. Starting with on balance. So if you've been doing PF for any length of time, you've seen on balance topics before. On balance is just an acknowledgement that there are good things and bad things on both sides of the topic. So Turkey's membership is beneficial in some ways and is not beneficial in other ways. These first two words acknowledge that right from the get-go. And that means that the topic will rely perhaps a bit more heavily than other ones on weighing. And so your job is really to convince the judge that your side has more impacts than the other side. So your side outweighs the other side, instead of just saying that Turkey's membership is just good or is just bad to NATO. Although that, of course, can be your stance as well. Turkey's membership. So I can think of two potential interpretations for Turkey's membership. I think the most reasonable way to think about this is to think about a parallel universe where everything is the same except for this one crucial thing. Turkey is not a member of NATO. In that parallel universe where Turkey is not a member of NATO, is NATO better or worse? Is it stronger or weaker? And if you consider the resolution in that light, sort of the parallel universe interpretation, I think that's the most reasonable way to think about if Turkey is, good or bad for NATO. So, for example, in this parallel universe where Turkey was not a member of NATO, all of the issues that Turkey has about security and corruption and pro-Russian sentiments, NATO would not have to deal with all of these things. So NATO could be potentially better. This is just one example, right? And I think that's really how you should be thinking about most of the arguments here. However, there is one crucial pro-argument that I'm going to present to you here that you can potentially use, that is presented in some of the literature. Obviously, when someone writes an article about Turkey's membership in NATO, they're not thinking about this particular PF resolution. They're just thinking about sort of their frame or their interpretation on the situation. And so their article might make a really, really good point that doesn't necessarily fit in with this resolution. And I'll give you the argument right now. It's a pro-argument, and it essentially says if Turkey was not part of NATO, it would be allies with other countries, namely Russia, and that would be bad. So it's good that Turkey is a member of NATO because it's therefore not a closer ally of Russia. However, this is not exactly what the resolution is asking, right? Obviously, there's many other scenarios we can imagine. For example, this scenario where Turkey leaves, but that's not what the resolution is asking, right? It's not saying would it be good or bad if Turkey left NATO. Now, you can certainly, if you are running this argument, you can add some kind of a definition that makes this argument kosher within the confines of this resolution. Or you could not, but be prepared to defend it in case you need to. And if you're on the con side and pro tries to run this argument, then it might be a good idea to bring it back to definition, right? The fact that other things could happen to Turkey in other parallel universes, in other worlds, it doesn't mean that we need to consider those things. We really need to just consider in an alternate universe, in a parallel universe, where Turkey was not a member of NATO, would NATO be better or worse? So these are two different definitions I can think of for Turkey's membership. There is also some discussion of kicking Turkey out of NATO, which is sort of a similar thing that would involve Turkey leaving, if not on its own accord. So something worth thinking about here. Next is, this implies the present tense. So there's a question, should we count past benefits to NATO? So there were certainly more reasons that Turkey, for example, was included in NATO to begin with, and that it's been really good in the past or really bad in the past for Turkey to be part of NATO. Should we count those things or not? For example, Turkey was a contributor to the war in Afghanistan, which was a NATO mission. Should we include that? I mean, the war in Afghanistan is quote-unquote over, right? So, given the word is, does past performance count? Next, beneficial. So NATO is a military organization. It's a defense organization. So beneficial probably means strength of military preparedness. That is most likely what beneficial means. There's other things that Turkey does that are good or bad that are not related to the military. Should we include those or should we not? That is a question. Last, to NATO. So there are things that Turkey does also that are, let's say, good or bad for the US, good or bad for other NATO members, good or bad for other countries, good or bad for the world. Should we include those or should we not? How would it affect NATO specifically, right? Let's say that Turkey, this is totally fake, but let's say that Turkey, has a large factory where they take puppy dogs and kick them, and they have a puppy kicking factory, and that's all they do. They kick puppies there. Horrible. That's horrible. They shouldn't do that. That's we should certainly condemn their puppy kicking. But does that hurt NATO? Does that hurt the military preparedness of NATO? Probably not, right? I mean, it's bad, but it doesn't really affect NATO that much. So if the impacts are not tied back to NATO specifically, and even more specifically to the military benefits associated with NATO, it might not be topical. It might be topical, but it might not be topical. So these are the things to consider for this resolution. All right, so we got 5 different actors, 5 different parties involved here. Turkey, NATO, Russia, Syria, US. There's some other ones, for example, Greece, Armenia, that we're not going to include here. Some potential other ones, but I've picked these 5. Let's go over these, and this should give you a decent understanding of what you'll need to know. So, Turkey is essentially a country that is geographically in the middle of a lot of things, right? I mean, as you can see on the map, it's in the middle of the Middle East, Russia, Europe, Africa, Asia. It's called the Eurasian Land Bridge. So, because its geography is so centrally located and really between so many major players, its politics also reflect that, and its interests also reflect that. And so that is really why we have so many different parties involved, is because it's really in the middle of everything, right? If we had a resolution that was about Iceland, for example, Iceland is not near to that many things. It's kind of in the middle of the ocean. It's maybe, it's European, it's maybe near Europe, but there wouldn't be so many, Africa wouldn't be so involved in Iceland. The Middle East wouldn't be so involved in Iceland. The geography just precludes all of these relations that Turkey necessarily has by its geography. This is just a fact of any country, is that many of its motivations, many of its actions are going to be determined by its actual geography. Just because we live in 2022 doesn't mean we've escaped the bounds of nature somehow. So, geopolitics. If you find any of this brief discussion interesting, I highly recommend subscribing to the Caspian Report on YouTube, which I think is, for any debater, the most important YouTube channel you could follow, that I found anyway. Caspian Report. Debate Track, of course, number 2. But Caspian Report is truly remarkable. The research is outstanding, and it's all about the geopolitics of different countries. Fascinating. So, the Caspian Report has 2 different Turkey videos, one about the geopolitics in relation to Asia, and one about the geopolitics in relation to Europe. Some things here. Turkey, amongst other countries, does border Syria, where there is an ongoing civil war, Iraq, Iran, major enemy of the U.S., of course, and also, I believe, shares a small border with Russia itself, if I'm not mistaken. I could be mistaken. And also Greece, sort of a historical enemy of Turkey. If I was going to add another bubble here, it'd probably be Greece, but Greece, sorry, you don't get your bubble this time. 97% of Turkey is in Anatolia, which is this peninsula sticking out of Asia. So technically in, Asia. Only 3% of the land area actually in Europe. One of the most powerful ways that Turkey can control can influence the region is through the Straits of Bosphorus. So their capital, Istanbul, sits at the Straits of Bosphorus, which is the channel to get from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. So these Straits of Bosphorus, if you want to take any ship, from the Black Sea to anywhere else, you'll need to go through those straits, and that includes any shipping, but also any military vessels. So the U.S. when it wants to kind of come and intimidate Russia or exercise freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, they got to go through these straits. Russia has a very large fleet, a very large naval fleet in the Black Sea, and if it wanted to expand the Black Sea fleet influence into the Mediterranean, it would have to go through Turkey, through the Straits of Bosphorus. Russia has a couple other major fleets. One is, I believe, stationed in Vladivostok. It's their Pacific fleet, and then an Arctic fleet as well. But the one that's really closest to Europe, most expedient to get to Europe, would be the Black Sea fleet. The region around Istanbul is called the Marmara region. There is a sea, as you can see on the upper map, the Sea of Marmara, which is, once again, right on their capital, Istanbul. Another big note is that to the east, so Turkey's east, there is the source of both the Tigris and Euphrates River, which are some of the major rivers for Iraq, for Syria, for several other countries there. And so Turkey really controls these major sources of fresh water. It's one of the major strengths of Turkey, geographically speaking, outside of the Straits of Bosphorus. So it controls this sort of shipping waterway, but it also controls a lot of fresh water. And as fresh water becomes more and more important around the world, Turkey will gain more and more power because of this fresh water. They have, for example, a lot of dams built on these rivers so they can get energy. This is like one benefit they have. But they could potentially just choke off these rivers and in that way sort of control many of their southern neighbors. So these are some brief notes on Turkish geopolitics. There's much, much more to say, some interesting mountain ranges and other ethnic groups we won't discuss. And these are all in the Caspian Report videos. If you are interested, not a whole lot will actually impact the topic, but it is fascinating at least. All right, we talk next about the Kurds, who you may have heard of. So the map on the bottom is what's considered Kurdistan. This is where all of the Kurds live. And Kurdistan really overlaps many different countries, right? Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Armenia, and a little bit in some other countries as well. The Kurds are the largest stateless nation in the world. So it's a group of people that don't have an actual country. So other examples of this would be the Catalans in Spain. For those of you who have been around doing PF for a while, you remember the Catalonia topic. The Rohingya in Myanmar, they are an ethnic group of people. They don't have their own state. The Tamils in Sri Lanka primarily, an ethnic group that don't have their own state. There's many examples of this in many, many countries. There are an absurd amount of ethnic groups around the world. It's very beautiful. But there are many, many more ethnic groups than countries. Kurds are the largest of these. So part of the Kurds is the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party. This is sort of a political group in Turkey, a guerrilla or terrorist movement that for a very long time was vying for their own state. So they were trying to get independence from Turkey so that Kurds would have their, something like Kurdistan, or at least a part of Kurdistan that the Kurds could call their own. Now, this never happened, and they're not even attempting to do this anymore, the PKK, but they are trying to get more rights, more political representation in Turkey. They are a terrorist group. I mean, they are violent, and they're considered a terrorist group by Turkey, but also by the U.S., also by the EU. But they have garnered a lot of sympathy from other countries, particularly people in the U.S., because they were military allies of the U.S. in different operations, particularly against ISIS. So the U.S. Peoples strongly feel that the U.S. government should support the Kurds. However, because Turkey sees them as terrorists, Turkey clearly does not support the Kurds. Even the label terrorist is a bit controversial because they don't really engage in terrorist activities per se. It's kind of anti-government activities. They're not trying to terrorize civilians. They don't target civilians particularly. It's really anti-government things. That's some notes on the Kurds. One other note on the Kurds. So they have an army, right? There's Kurdish soldiers in Turkey, and that number is anywhere from 4 to 32,000 under the PKK. It's a very large range, and I haven't. This is just according to Wikipedia. I haven't gone in and tried to find what the actual number is. The numbers on their population, including their number of soldiers, is iffy. Okay, that's yes, something about the Kurds. Let's talk about the man of the hour, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. This is the president of Turkey. Recep Tayyip Erdogan. I recommend that you learn how to say his name correctly because you'll sound cool. If your opponent is saying it wrong and you're saying it right, you'll sound cool. So say it right. Recep Tayyip Erdogan. If there's any Turkish students watching, please correct my pronunciation or tell me it's good, and I'll be happy. So, Erdogan has a long and storied history with Turkey. He's the former mayor of their capital, Istanbul, the former prime minister of the country, and you'll recognize some characteristics between him and some of the other major leaders around the world, Putin and Xi Jinping. He's populist. He's nationalist, and his main motivation is to stay in power. So, populist, this is a term for a way of thinking and talking where you say, look, it's us against them. Like, populist, we are the people, and there's this sort of elite group that we are against, right? Maybe we're against the rich, right? Maybe we're against the people who have been in power for a long time, right? Or we're against the government, right? We are the common people, and the elites can't bring us down. We have to fight against the elites. That is the sort of populist message. Nationalist, that also includes saying that your nation is a great and powerful nation, specifically, right? Maybe your people's the Turks, right? The Turks above everything else. So it's kind of the people against, the elites. It's the saying, hey, like our ethnicity is the best ethnicity. The other ethnicities are causing us problems, or we can blame them for issues in our country. Another kind of nationalist thing. He's also, once again, his main motivation is to stay in power. I think you can understand him better if you remember this. His main motivation is not to help Turkey. It's not to help the Turkish people. It's not to fight against anything particular. It's not even, let's say he's fought against the Kurds. It's not even anti-Kurd. His main motivation is to stay in power. He's also authoritarian. This will help some leaders to stay in power because authoritarian is you are trying to control as much as you possibly can. You're trying to get as much power concentrated into your hands as possible. So crack down on a lot of civil rights, a lot of human rights. Media and internet access have been cracked down on. A lot of censorship. Very arbitrary arrests, politically motivated arrests are very common in Turkey, and also a lot of corruption. So especially in voting, it's not really a democratic system under his rule per se. So, 2013, there were some anti-government protests, fairly large. You might and might not group this with the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring started like 2011. So 13 is not far after that. I do not know if it would be appropriate to group them or not. I do not know the answer to this. But anyway, anti-government protests. 2016, there was a large military coup, which he survived. So essentially, there's a faction of the armed forces of the military who tried to take control of the government. They were defeated by another faction, a loyalist faction of the military. It was a fairly short affair. And it was said to have been orchestrated by a guy, I don't know how to say his name, I think it's Gulen, or something like Gulen, who is a Turkish businessman, politician, thought leader. He lives in Pennsylvania, in America. Now, Turkey claims that the U.S. is harboring him, which they are harboring him. They did not deport him to Turkey, certainly, so yeah, I guess that it means they're harboring him. Gulen also denies that he was involved in the coup. But what is for sure is that many of the people who organized and carried out this coup were Gulen fans. They were essentially Gulenites, something like that. So they were, followers of his thought and his philosophy, and so in that way he orchestrated it. Whether he was involved in the planning or not, perhaps is a moot point. It was sort of the Gulen loyalists who made it happen. So what's interesting is what happened afterwards. I mean, this is all interesting, but what happened afterwards, Erdogan used this as a pretext, and I mean, perhaps this is necessary, right? Like, you want to stay in power, you have your people all hate you, the military is trying to overthrow you, like, you better take some pretty extreme action, otherwise you're not going to stay in power, right? Which, once again, that's his main goal, right? He's not going to step down just because everyone hates him. That's not a good reason. A large-scale crackdown and purge afterwards. 40,000 people detained. Almost 3,000 of those people were judges. So, yeah, talk about opportunism to cleanse the ranks. Arrested 3,000 judges. 21,000 teachers were fired. Totally, during the whole course of this crackdown, there have been 77,000 people arrested. 160,000 people fired from their jobs, and all of this for connections to Gulen, for being a loyalist to Gulen, for not being loyal to, I don't know what his party is called, let's say loyal to Erdogan, right? Recep Tayyip Erdogan. A couple other notes about Turkey that may be interesting. So it's the former Ottoman Empire. If you can slip that somewhere into your case, since the dark reaches of history, the Ottoman Empire is always blah, 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 you'll sound cool. You'll also maybe sound kind of weird. I don't know. Turkey's 99% Muslim, so that's important. Turkey is also undergoing a currency crisis. So if you look up Turkey in the news, this will be the main thing. It won't be mainly about NATO. It will mainly be about their currency crisis, the Turkish lira. Given the nationalist bent of the politics, of course, the currency crisis is blamed on other countries, mainly on the U.S. However, according to people who actually know about money, that's not what's causing it. Apparently, the banks are just being horribly mismanaged. So if the Turkish monetary system was managed well, it would apparently be not that bad. But right now they have 100% inflation, something like that. So it's a true issue that they're having with their money. That is Turkey. Now on to NATO. We did actually do a NATO topic last spring. It was about the Baltic states. So you'll be at a good advantage if you did the Baltic states topic. Or if you know anything else about NATO. So it's once again a defense organization, right? It was founded to oppose the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union's not around anymore, but it's kind of still there to oppose Russia. And by the way, if we talked about this with the last topic, but it's if you think Russia is scary and we need NATO, imagine you're Russia. And you have 30 countries that get together to team up against you. Imagine how scary that is for Russia. So when you think about, their history of being invaded and, their former place in the world as the Soviet Union and, this large defense organization expanding towards their heartland, you understand why Russia is scared. Like, their actions are very logical given this 30, it's not one country versus one country, it's 30 countries versus Russia. Like, that's not okay for Russia. Anyway, defense organization, 30 different members. Turkey is one of them. Turkey joined in 1953, along with Greece. They joined, I believe, at the same time. Importantly here, though, this debate is about defense-related impacts, unless you can make a good case as to why it shouldn't be about defense-related impacts. So if your case is just about how Turkey is really good for NATO's defense or how it's really bad for NATO's defense, that's a good, solid case, right? And you should be enforcing this rule that is about defense-related impacts, and you should not let your opponents bring other impacts in. On the other hand, if you want to bring other impacts in, be ready to defend why they should be included. And there are some reasons. So, let me talk about some of those other reasons, actually, before we talk about the benefits. In the background section of the evidence, and even if you don't get the evidence, you can still look this up, is the North Atlantic Treaty. And I would recommend reading that. In the evidence, it's 2 pages, and so it's fairly short, right? I would definitely read the North Atlantic Treaty. These are the founding documents of NATO. A couple quotes. 1, members should refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. So you can see, even in the founding documents, NATO is related to the UN. And here's one area that we can slip in potential other impacts, is that relation to the UN. And also, that countries should refrain from the threat or use of force in any manner inconsistent with the UN. Which means that if a country is attacking other countries, other groups of people, that is, on its face, contrary to the North Atlantic Treaty, and therefore might be a reason the country is not a great member of NATO. Now, you could apply this to Turkey, you could apply this to other countries as well, but you could apply it to Turkey. Second quote, the parties will contribute towards the further development of peace and friendly international relations by strengthening their free institutions. So, right in the text of the North Atlantic Treaty, it talks about free institutions, right? If your institutions become corrupt and oppressive, this might be also contrary to the North Atlantic Treaty. And here is the way that you could potentially slip in human rights impacts, because there are a lot of those. So if a country is not strengthening their free institutions, they are against the basic charter of NATO. And therefore, this might be a reason that they're not being a good member. The last note, also from the North Atlantic Treaty, is that the U.S. is mentioned many times as the manager of NATO. Quote-unquote manager. I don't think it uses that word, but a lot of the, essentially all of the paperwork has to be done by the U.S. government. So the U.S. did set up NATO. You know, it is the most important member of NATO. It's the biggest military in NATO. It's the biggest counterweight to Russia. So it is a U.S.-centric organization, and that is noted several times in the North Atlantic Treaty. The United States specifically is mentioned by name many times, that other countries are not. Turkey joined in 1953, and this was... they had wanted to join for a little bit, I believe. And I believe they only joined perhaps 2 years after it was made, after NATO was made. Turkey helped the U.S. in the Korean War. And that is sort of their ticket, how they politically gained access to NATO. All right, why are they in NATO? What are the good things about it? The big thing is Article 5. This is mutual defense. This is the most famous article in NATO. In fact, before I had read the North Atlantic Treaty, I didn't even know what the other articles were, but this is what Article 5 is, which is if one country gets attacked, all the other countries have to come help out. Pretty cool benefit, right? Like, if you get attacked, you've got 29 other people, other countries that are going to come help you with your conflict. Pretty sweet, right? Now, Article 5, we don't actually know how it would be used in practice, right? Because it's been used once before, and it's kind of like not what you'd expect. It was after September 11th in the U.S., right? The U.S. gets attacked by terrorists, and the U.S. decides to go invade Afghanistan, and NATO's like, okay, no problem. And so the mission to invade Afghanistan was a NATO mission. That is the one time the Article 5 has been invoked. It's never been invoked in a more, let's say, conventional, a state-on-state war. So how this would play out remains to be seen. NATO provides political stability. The biggest example of this vis-a-vis Turkey is the lack of war between Turkey and Greece. So there was a conflict between the two countries in 1974, Cyprus conflict, and they did not escalate into a full-scale war. So we can thank NATO for that, most likely. On the other hand, they do still have a lot of tensions, right? They, for example, like fly jets over each other constantly. That's, I guess, just what countries do when they don't like each other. They fly jets if they're close enough. And this hasn't stopped despite being in NATO. So it hasn't erupted into like a hot war, but it's also, they still got the tensions there, right? NATO also provides for intelligence sharing. So they, whatever that means, they share info with each other. And I bet 12 also talks about NATO being a diplomatic tool for Turkey. So if you got 29 other countries ready to fight for you, obviously you have a little bit more leeway in what you do and say, right? If Turkey's all on their loan, there's a lot less they can do. So it's a good diplomatic tool just for sort of negotiations. It also provides, for Turkey specifically, nuclear weapons. This is not on the slide, but it's on other slides. EPAA, the European Phased Adaptive Approach, quoting from armscontrol.org, is the U.S. contribution to NATO's missile defense system and is designed to protect Europe against ballistic missiles launched from Iran, specifically. Turkey is very close to Iran. Ooh, no, that is missile defense. I'm so sorry. That is not nuclear weapons, although we'll also talk about nuclear weapons. But the U.S. provides missile defense against Iranian missiles, specifically. And there's a big contingent of that in Turkey. So those are some good things about being in NATO for Turkey and for other countries. How about benefits for NATO of the Turkish Armed Forces? The Turkish Armed Forces is the largest, the second largest military in NATO. And that is measured by, it's not necessarily the second most powerful, but based on the number of forces and the number of tanks, and I believe also the number of like boats. I don't know how they measure the number of ships. I don't know how they measure that, but there's several metrics where they've got a lot of stuff, right? I don't know if they're necessarily the most advanced, although in one area they're extremely advanced, which is drones. They're a major supplier of military drones. They also have a couple bases. Incirlik and one other one. Incirlik is the famous one because there's 50 nukes stationed there. Oh, it says as part of EPAA. I don't know if that is or not. I think maybe, but I'm not sure. But anyway, these are 50 nukes from the United States, and they're sort of taken care of by a contingent of the U.S. military. I believe it's some low thousands of people. So, I mean, a lot, but not a lot of people to be guarding these 50 nukes. So we'll talk about this later anyway. So we have Incirlik and one other base. I did believe at some point that Incirlik was a U.S. base. It turns out it's just a base. It's just a Turkish Air Force base, but there's this sort of U.S. division stationed there. There's also other like NATO missions there, and there's a bunch of Turkish soldiers there. It's not like a U.S. base per se in the way that there are a lot of other U.S. bases. It's like a Turkish base with like a bunch of U.S. soldiers there. So Turkey has helped with a number of missions. Most importantly, the war on terror. The war on terror. They've been, they're near to Syria. They're near to Iraq. So especially in the fight against Al Qaeda and ISIS, they've been crucial because, NATO, once again, remember the map is kind of like a finger sticking out from Europe, sticking out from NATO into this crucial, volatile area, the Middle East, where most of the war on terror has taken place. It's kind of the trigger finger of NATO. They've also helped with immigration a ton. We'll talk about that in a little bit. This is the biggest kind of human rights props you got to give to Turkey is they've been amazing on immigration, specifically from Syria. They've also helped with Afghanistan, as we mentioned. They're very important for the Black Sea, just for Black Sea defense, the Balkans, and they do help to fly patrol missions. So yeah, NATO airspace is like constantly being patrolled by different members, and Turkey helps with that. So there's like a cool video of Polish soldiers or Polish people from Poland and Turks doing these like air patrol missions together. You can go look it up. It's pretty cool. I mean, yeah, whatever. They help. Now, these are, of course, pretty standard things, right? Some of these things like contributing soldiers to NATO missions, having bases in your countries. These aren't necessarily uniquely Turkish. The biggest real military advantage that Turkey brings to NATO is its geography, is just its location in the world. But also the fact that it has such a large armed forces is like pretty neato, right? Turkey has threatened to leave NATO before, but they won't do that, probably. On to Russia. So, Russia and Turkey have major differences. They also have major commonalities, major sources of mutual interest. And so it's not really appropriate to say that Turkey and Russia are enemies. It's not really appropriate to say they're friends. Remember that Turkey is a member of NATO, and NATO is an anti-Russian defense organization. So Turkey is part of a major anti-Russian defense organization. So you can't just say they're friends. I think the biggest commonality between them that seems sort of obvious on its face is their leaders, who are, once again, they're both corrupt, they're both motivated to stay in power, they both don't hold free elections, neither of them are democratic, they're both engaged in censorship, they suppress the media, they arrest their political rivals, Russia sometimes murders their political rivals, or Putin does. Putin, not Russia, Putin. They both share hostility towards the West. I don't know what the numbers are in Russia, but in Turkey, the United States is very unpopular. Turkish people see the U.S. as a much greater threat towards Turkey than they see Russia as a threat. But I'm talking about the leaders. They share hostility towards the West as well. And so their leaders share a lot in common. Now, we don't want to conflate Erdogan and Turkey because, once again, they're not the same thing. They're also not the same thing as their militaries. So if the Turkish military is a large asset to NATO, but Erdogan is hostile to NATO, it could still be that Turkey is incredibly valuable to NATO. But the leader, especially when they are going to stay in power indefinitely, and when they're authoritarian and are consolidating as much power as possible, especially under those circumstances, the leader is very important for what the country is. And it's not like Turkey's going to have an election soon and replace Erdogan. Like, he is going to try as much as he possibly can to stay in power. That is his motivation. So this commonality and their leaders, it is not unimportant. But there's actual cooperation. Once again, Turkey and Russia are neighbors, so they're going to cooperate. Turkey's bought some military equipment from Russia, tanks, jets, some other things. They also have economic cooperation on energy is the big thing. So gas. For nuclear, I believe it's next, or this year, 2022, that the first Russian-built Turkish nuclear plant will open. And just some trade tourism. So tourism from Russia to Turkey is very popular. Turkey is just a gorgeous, gorgeous country. So there's a ton of, they have a big tourist industry because it's beautiful. They have a bunch of like really nice beaches, and it's just, they got good food, and it's like not that expensive. Like it's the place to go apparently. I've never been, but I want to go. They do have some major differences though. And their major differences are essentially Turkey keeps fighting wars with Russia, proxy wars, not direct wars, but proxy wars. These are in Syria, Libya, the Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict, which is to Turkey's right, to their east. So these proxy wars are kind of a big deal. In Syria, Russia backs the president of the country, and Turkey backs rebel groups. In Libya, Russia backs the rebels, Turkey backs the government. They've sent Syrian fighters, for example, to Libya. In the third conflict, Russia supports the Armenians, Turkey supports the Azerbaijanis. It's a whole thing. But the biggest thing, the biggest sort of wedge between them is Turkey's ongoing support of Ukraine. So they do have a lot of cooperation, Turkey and Russia, but most of this is best seen as opportunistic. It's not that they have warm feelings in their heart for one another. It's just that their leaders are similar. They see eye to eye on domestic management techniques, we might say, and there's some major areas where their interests dovetail, and so they cooperate on those interest areas. But overall, Russia is, as every big country is, expansionist. You don't get to be a big country unless you are keen on taking other territories, right? If you don't have that inclination, you're never going to become a big country. Russia's a pretty big country. Why do you think that is? Yeah, I mean, same goes with China, U.S., like Brazil. This is what big countries do. So that's pretty scary to Turkey, right? Like, I mean, Turkey's not a small country either, and they have their own interest. Obviously, in the Black Sea, we didn't mention this, but this is like very important. Black Sea could definitely be a whole case. And if I was going to have a third bubble, I should probably do a Black Sea bubble, but we got our major parties involved here, Russia, Turkey. When Russia took over the Crimean Peninsula, that peninsula is in the Black Sea. That's a big reason why they took it, is because it's their access into the Black Sea and beyond. So very crucially important. Russia just took that, and that makes Turkey quite wary. Turkey doesn't want Russia to have more power. That's not good for Turkey. So they support Ukraine's sovereignty. They support even Ukraine's NATO membership, and they have sold a lot of drones to Ukraine. Once again, Turkish drones are cheap. They're effective. They've shown to be highly effective in different wars. And Turkey uses these drones to fight against Russia with these proxy wars. Especially in Libya, they've used them to destroy anti-missile batteries, things like that. So really good, really cheap flying death robots in the sky that Turkey exports to other countries. They are truly, drones are truly a dystopian development. There's even a case to be made that they're good, but they are dystopian and terrifying. And that's what Turkey's all about. So these are the differences. They fight wars. Okay. Now on to the big news between the two of them. The S-400 purchase is number one, the biggest indication of Turkey's growing affinity to Russia. Number two, the biggest wedge in the relationship between Turkey and NATO and the NATO/US and Turkey. And number three, just a hilarious, it's truly a hilarious turn of events for Turkey. So the S-400 is an anti-missile battery. And it's actually like a ground-based missile launcher, missile defense system. Perhaps that's how to put it. They're little missiles that shoot down other missiles. I mean, they also can shoot down drones. They can shoot down jets, shoot down airplanes. They shoot down like whatever's in the sky. Potentially other things as well. I'm not sure. I've never shot a missile before. I don't know how they work. But they're mainly used for missile defense to shoot down like jets and airplanes and other missiles. They had wanted before to purchase a Patriot system from the US, which is way better for NATO because all of the NATO equipment can work together very well. It's sort of like having like an iPhone and a Mac. They just work really well. You can airdrop. You can't airdrop with the Russian system and the US system. They're not compatible, and they probably don't want. Neither side probably wants them to be compatible either. So they purchased them in 2017. Invoked U.S. sanctions. The U.S. was like, you can't do that, and like sanctioned Turkey. And that's, by the way, why Turkey blames the U.S. for their ongoing currency crisis as U.S. sanctions arrived in 2019. It seems, though, that their second purchase is floundering, and this is the reason it's kind of hilarious, is that Russia refuses to transfer the software to Turkey. It's like some key control software, specifically I believe it's called the friend or foe system, which IDs, whether a particular thing flying in the sky is a friend or a foe. Now, why would Russia not want to give Turkey control over this? Well, probably because Turkey might program it to shoot down Russian jets, which Russia doesn't want. So, in short, this system is useless against Russian jets. And Russia is keeping it that way. And, they still got all of these, it's much more than a slap on the hand. I mean, they have serious economic consequences from the U.S. and military consequences from the U.S. we'll look at later. Once again, they had shopped around to some different countries, right? France, UK, with the SAMP-T missiles, China, they'd kind of entertained different offers. But they ended up going with Russia in 2017. Their first purchase was 2 batteries, 120 plus missiles. But these missiles or these systems have not yet been deployed. And it's probably because they need the software to make them work effectively. So they purchased these systems and suffered horrible consequences because of it. And they don't even work. They can't even use them. The story gets even better later on. But this really was a key move of Erdogan to show his sort of independence from the U.S., independence from NATO, kind of saying like, hey, we can do whatever we want. Like, we don't have to like give in to your demands. Like, we can purchase whatever we want. And NATO's like, no, you can't actually. And also their things don't even work. So it's kind of funny. So that is the basic facts of the relationship with Russia. Let's talk about Syria now with the ongoing civil war. I don't know. What is there to say about their war? It's just horrible, And this really was started from the Arab Spring protest, 2011. And we have 500,000 people dead, combatants on several sides, mostly civilians. Those dead are mostly civilians. And about half of Syrians displaced, 6 million internally displaced, 6 million refugees. I've seen some numbers that say half of all Syrians have been displaced, although the numbers I'm pulling down make it look like a lot more. Proxy war between Russia and the U.S., although each side supports the U.S. especially supports several different groups in there. We have the Kurds there. Their main motivation is just to try to establish a state in Syria, kind of carve out an area during the conflict to, have their own country. Iraq is involved, Iran is involved, Turkey's involved. We have like so many major world players that are it's just a lot of concentrated firepower. I mean, it's really horrible. There's other thoughts about it, primarily being in terms of U.S. and Russia over oil control. That doesn't sound like a bad theory to me. I wish I knew more about this horrible topic. I don't. So this war, just kind of what I went over. For Turkey, it's about fighting the fighting the Kurds in Syria. So Turkey has been at different times involved and not involved. They've had 4 different separate offensive campaigns in the war since 2016 is when they first got involved. So they haven't been involved the whole time, but this is a major conflict happening on their border, so they have to be involved. Just for defense, they have to be involved. And so they'll, for example, deploy tanks to their border to make sure that there aren't like incursions onto their territory. But a big part of it is sort of anti-Kurd, because remember, Turkey hates. I mean, it's a terrorist organization in their country, right? So, it's like if the U.S. would get another chance to fight ISIS, heck yeah, let's go do it, right? Goals for Erdogan, though, as with everything, stay in power. So Erdogan, his party, alongside another party, the Justice and Development Party, there are 2 major powers in Turkey, banded together in order to help both of them stay in power, and also to oppress the votes and rights of the Kurdish party. So there's a Kurdish political party in Turkey, and neither side wants them to be doing well. So part of this goal is something like a pretext to suppress Kurdish rights and representation, which is just this kind of long-standing goal of, let's say, large part of the Turkish government. But it is also helps them to build up their armed forces. So after the military coup, once again, this is the military trying to take over the country, just a faction of it, but still, the armed forces needed a way to bring back their credibility, and also to build up their armed forces, to get a bigger, let's say, budget to kind of build out their military. And what better way than a war to do that? So a lot of great little goals that go together to giving more power to the military, giving more power to Erdogan, making sure he stays in power longer, helping to further suppress the Kurds, and just defense of their country. So that is essentially their playbook here in Syria. Major immigrant crisis from Syria, as you likely know. Once again, half of Syrians or more being displaced. Turkey has taken in and cared for more refugees than any other country. Turkey is the number 1 country for taking in refugees, more than any Arab state, which the Arab states, by the way, don't really take in refugees. That's not really a thing they do. It's mainly been a European thing, taking refugees, but Turkey's taken in far more than any European country. Because Turkey is really the route to Europe, though, they do control this pathway of immigration. They control the floodgates as it would be. They control them, okay? And that means that a Turkey that is friendly to Europe will be able to manage and control and stem this flow of immigrants. Turkey that's unfriendly to Europe is able to just unleash true crises. Not to say that anything we've seen immigration-wise is not a crisis, but you could see a crisis being a worse crisis and a less bad crisis. So that is sort of the significance of Turkey for the immigration crisis in relation to Europe. But just overall, the way that Turkey has taken care of so many refugees is admirable, I would say. Before we go on, there's a lot of theory that could be talked about in terms of Turkey and NATO, and the U.S. and the West that I haven't included here, and that is, I believe it's kind of related to critical race theory. It's sort of the I don't remember what the word for it is, but sort of the otherization, like essentially like a lot of NATO is like white and like, once again, quote unquote Western, like European, and so there's a case to be made that a lot of the treating Turkey differently is the otherizing of Turkey, I mean some sort of implicit racism towards the Turks, and this is just a fact of like interpersonal relations, and you can see this in a lot of like history between Turkey and other countries. It's like Turkey is definitely like a second-rate player in the NATO scene, and there's a lot to be said about that. And if you are getting a little bit bored of PF, you might consider running some kind of case. Try to look up the word that I can't think of. I'll put it in the comments. Can't think of it's a normal word. It's Orientalism. Yeah, that would be the case. An Orientalism case. About how Turkey is like kind of cool and they make all these carpets and they have this nice food and they're all like brown and stuff, and we have this kind of like strange perception of Turkey, I mean a lot of like the Middle East as being this kind of like certain way, right? And then because they're this certain way, we have this sort of certain relationship, a certain approach to them. A lot that could be said about that that I do not cover in this lecture, but that is an interesting thing that popped into my mind that would be worth covering. U.S. So, once again, the number one NATO member militarily. They're also the manager, quote unquote, of NATO. They do support the Kurds, so they are historical military allies, right, especially against ISIS. And that is why it seems so sort of disgusting to Americans. And this was especially 2 years ago, 3 years ago, a couple of years ago. There was an incident where Turkey was ready to launch a offensive campaign against the Kurds in Syria. They were ready to go bomb a bunch of Kurds, and President Trump got a call, I believe, from the leader. I mean, the administrator. They Turkey called the U.S. and they're like, "Hey, we're like about to bomb all the Kurds," and the U.S. pulled their troops. They had a bunch of Marines there. They pulled their troops out of that area. So they wouldn't be bombed. So that's nice that we don't get bombed. But we left our allies kind of in a lurch there, right? We just left them there to be bombed and murdered by Turkey. So yeah, this incident was truly disgusting to a lot of Americans, and I don't know what to make of it. Yeah, it is a travesty, but also sort of given the relationship between Turkey and Kurds, it's not surprising, right? And that is Turkey's neighborhood. I'm not saying they have a right to murder people, but it's not a shock. That's all. It's not a shock. So let's talk about the S-400 sale from the U.S.'s perspective. So the U.S. really sees this system as, so at first it's useless to NATO, right? Because it can't be incorporated into NATO systems, right? It doesn't like work with the rest of NATO systems. It's not going to like share in a lot of the theory of modern warfare is integrated warfare. It's making sure that your jets and your communications and your intelligence and your your missile defense batteries and everything is all integrated and sharing info with each other, so that all of your many components can kind of act as one. Right, and if that's not built into the technology because it's Russian, then it can't be really useful for NATO. Maybe useful for Turkish defense, but not for NATO defense. But more importantly, it's actually harmful to NATO because it can be used to potentially by the Russians. And if you don't think the Russians are using their own systems, like what? Of course they are. Like even though they're selling them for defense to another country, like yeah, they're still going to be using them. I mean, they hack into everything. Why would they not hack into their own things? Like, of course. And if they're not, like, okay, that would be shocking, but they probably are, right? So it's harmful to NATO because it can be used by Russia to track NATO assets, specifically like jets, potentially to gather information in other ways. I mean, this is one of the world's most advanced air defense systems. So it's extremely technologically advanced. There's a lot of ways it could be used by Russia to harm NATO. So there's this program that's underway by the U.S. military to build the fifth gen fighter jets, the F-35, and they're multi-role aircraft. So they're for bombing missions. They're for as fighter jet capabilities, also for gathering intel, surveillance. They're really, they're fifth gen. They're next level, and they're still under development, but they're also under production. They're both. They started to build them before they were ready, designing them, I guess, something like that. Which once again, I never built a jet. I don't know how to do it. It's easy to complain if you're not the one doing it. But they canceled the order to Turkey. So Turkey wanted to, they had actually paid for 100 of these jets because they're awesome, and Turkey wanted some, and they are awesome. I want some too. And so they put an order for 100, and when Turkey bought this S-400 system, the U.S. was like, we're not going to sell those to you. We're not going to sell them to you. We're not going to do it. And the U.S. didn't refund their money. So Turkey spent $1.4 billion so far on these jets. And the U.S. was just like, nah, we're going to keep that probably. I don't know if it was something contractually, likely it was. Erdogan wants the money back. I think he had a convo with Joe Biden about it. And so far, they don't have that money back, as far as I know. I don't know if that's, in process or if the U.S. is just going to kind of keep that. But they were sanctioned as well under CAATSA, Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, which is an act specifically set up for Iran, North Korea, and Russia. And there are a number of ways that, events that can trigger sanctions under CAATSA, but apparently buying S-400s is one of them. Interesting side note, in 2020, John Thune, who's a senator, proposed a congressperson, I believe he's a senator, he proposed purchasing the S-400 system from Turkey so that the U.S. would just buy the S-400 system from Turkey. And therefore we could end the sanctions to Turkey and reinstate this F-35 program. Obviously, we want our military allies to be well equipped with our nice stuff, right? Which includes these jets. And we also don't want to be sanctioning our friends. That's not a nice thing to do at all. That's not good for anyone. So we're trying to, Mr. John Thune tried to find some kind of solution to it. Another side note is that so Turkey was sanctioned for buying the S-400 system. Greece, who is also a NATO member, operates the S-300, the previous version of the S-400. So it's a little bit kind of what are you doing sanctioning Turkey if you're not sanctioning Greece? India is also planning to buy the S-400. It's an awesome system. It's really good. So and so they may also face sanctions from the U.S., although they are also a strong ally of the U.S., so will they actually face sanctions? Will they not? That remains to be seen. All right, that is the U.S. Once again, these are just a few of the bubbles, but we're an hour in, so I feel like that's probably enough bubbles before we move on. This lecture, as with all lectures, is not comprehensive. It is a bit of the information. It is, I think, most of the important information. Let's talk about pro-arguments, shall we? So when I put these summaries in the pro and con bubbles, these are really kind of case summaries. They're potential case summaries where I try to sum up a lot of the arguments. This is if you're trying to run most of the arguments that I'm presenting. Which is maybe not necessarily always a good idea. But I recommend having these and kind of thinking in these terms, probably for every single speech. It's what is your main point in this speech? This would be for your case. What's your main point in this? Can you sum up your case in 2 sentences? You should do that. You should be able to do that. And that's how you can start your case. It's a really good way to kind of put in everyone's mind. And also just to make sure you have your key talking points down. But you can also rephrase it, right? Like if you're going for a certain collapse in summary, you can sort of zoom in on one of these things. Like Turkey has like large armed forces. You're like collapsing on the large armed forces. And you like, what are the two sentences you could say about the large armed forces that are like the key of your collapse here, right? Or, if you're, yeah, if you're going for some kind of like weighing and the final focus, like what is your like brief summary of this thing so you can like call it back into the present moment and then like work with it. So I would recommend trying to think of and even write down for like all of your speeches, like what is your main point here? And this would be one potential way you could do that, right? Turkey has been a NATO member for 70 years, and during that time has been a major contributor towards NATO goals and missions. Turkey is a vital asset to NATO. Its geopolitics, large armed forces, and contributions mean that NATO would be significantly weaker without Turkey. So in terms of the military, this is going to be the main bubble in the whole presentation for Pro, right? NATO's a military organization, so we want to talk about the military. That is the main thing we want to do. So let's do it. Turkey is the number 2 military in NATO. This is Erdogan 21, but a lot of different sources. Once again, by troops, by planes. To the current NATO mission, I believe they're contributing somewhere on the order of $13 million a year, something like that. They have like almost 445 personnel involved in NATO missions. Once again, these are things like patrolling airspace or just kind of being on standby. There's like a standby NATO, like a rapid response. I don't know any military words. There's a group of soldiers that's like a rapid response group in case, there's anything goes down. As we've talked about, geographically, they're extremely significant. Alan Who's 19 talks about that. Also, we have in the Black Sea specifically, once again, this could easily be a whole case just about the Black Sea. Turkey's also building a new canal from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. So they have kind of like another waterway. And I believe there are treaties. There is a treaty right now governing the Strait of Bosphorus. So under international law, Turkey kind of like has to let like certain numbers of ships in and out. There's some kind of quota system. There's some kind of rules. So in other words, under this treaty, Turkey is like kind of not allowed to like just restrict access. But they're building a new canal that I think is just theirs, and they can just use that. On military strength, as we've talked about, tons of drones. They've supplied drones to Poland, NATO member, to Ukraine, not a NATO member, but a NATO ally, we could say. And there's other NATO countries that are thinking about buying drones. So another great contention / case would be just drones. They are truly badass, truly terrifying, but very effective. And Turkey's like the number 1 country handed those babies out. Yeah, so geographically we have all these things, Black Sea, Syria, Iran. I don't really have any Iran cards, but there could be a lot of Iran cards. We gotta stop cutting cards at some point to get these videos out in time. Turkey does counter Russia, so Congressional Research Service. Those are essentially all the wars we just talked about. And they do support NATO missions, which once again is kind of a normal thing, but they do it. And it also, NATO helps Turkey to push for collective action. I Bet 12 talks about Libya, about the how there was just kind of an ad hoc different group in Libya fighting some different wars, doing some different kind of missions. And Turkey was like, no, we got to bring this together under NATO. And, NATO ended up bringing it together. So it's a little bit more coordinated efforts there. And of course the military bases, important part of the geography. These two ones, Incirlik and Izmir. It's Bay-18. How can we answer these things? As with the last video, I recommend pausing the video right now and trying to brainstorm as many ways as you can to counter all of these. I don't have a complete list, but I have some ideas. So pause or don't pause, and let's look at my answers that I have. So just because it's a big military doesn't mean it's good, right? Like China is also a big military. Should we include them in NATO? Like that's not enough. Like you can be really like anti any kind of given country and have a large military. I mean, look at, for example, like what happened with was Hitler a good ally of Soviet Union during World War II? I mean, they had a very large military, so that makes him a good ally, right? The assistance, once again, is non-unique. Every NATO member contributes to NATO missions, like they're supposed to. Like, you get a lot more benefits of NATO than you have to, like, work. And so just the fact that they have some assistance doesn't mean a whole lot. And then, the biggest counter would just be the offense of military vulnerability that we'll talk about in Khan. We've already touched on that a bit with the S-400 purchase. Turkey could be a major vulnerability, and that would be sort of the strongest case against this argument. And then we could talk about Turkey helping under duress, if they're not under duress, but if there was under some kind of conflict situation. So if Article 5 was invoked and we called on Turkey to help defend, Poland or Lithuania or whatever, like, would they step up? We don't actually know, because once again, it's only been invoked once, and for this kind of particular, like, terrorist group situation with the U.S. So Karadas 21 is just like, we don't really know what will happen with Article 5, but it also mentions Turkey specifically. Some potential answers. The next argument is the one that I touched on in the definitions discussion, which is the non-alliances, the alliances that Turkey doesn't have because they are part of NATO. So, it is very possible that Turkey would become much closer to Russia without NATO. If they weren't a part of NATO, they would likely be much closer to Russia. Now, there's some very good reasons that Turkey would not want to be close to, would choose NATO in the West and the US over Russia. One of the big reasons is that Turkey's economy relies on large cash injections, which Russia is simply not able to provide. But once again, Turkey is a very large military and at a very crucial intersection geographically. And so for Russia to have Turkey as a military ally would be a major win for them. So that is one thing. We also have a card, Applebaum 21, talking about Turkey's growing relationship with China. For example, Erdogan and his government have been very willing to echo CCP propaganda, as has, by the way, many governments. Once again, not necessarily unique to Erdogan, but including him and his party. Turkey has helped with the extradition of Uyghurs from Turkey to China, where they face God knows what depths of horror. Turkey has therefore been complicit in genocide. And once again, not on a large scale, but anytime this happens, so essentially Uyghurs in Turkey will be arrested on trumped up terrorism charges, extradited either directly to China or via some other countries first, and end up in China. So, these two countries could be very close allies of Turkey if it weren't for NATO. Now, you might see these as sort of con arguments, but the fact is that Russia and Turkey aren't close allies, and China and Turkey aren't close allies. So I think it's probably better as a pro argument to say that it could be way worse, right? Like, Turkey is essentially a NATO ally, a close cooperator with the West, and especially in terms of military. So I think this is a potential argument for, as I said, for pro, that if Turkey wasn't a member of NATO, it could be really, really bad for NATO because it would be allies with these other countries, namely Russia, but potentially also China. Now on Russia, of course, this could help with Russian expansionism. Russia does want to expand as much as possible into former Soviet states, but that could also just be increasing its sphere of influence beyond these former Soviet states into, once again, say Turkey. The more allies that Russia can get, the better it is for Russia. And so this could really help. Obviously, Turkey has been a supporter of Ukraine. If Russia could switch that stance, it would be just a huge win for Russia. So it is doubtless that Russia is trying to grow close to Turkey. Putin certainly is trying to reel Erdogan in a little bit. It has in the past been through concessions. It's not clear that he really has to do that anymore now that he's nicely alienated from the West. But the point still stands. Turkey could be a powerful ally of Russia. In terms of, there's another thing I didn't put in here, which is nukes. So once again, Turkey has around about 50 nukes from NATO, from the U.S. Stationed at Incirlik. And that's pretty cool. That means that Turkey has sort of a nuclear umbrella over it, and they could just be launched from Turkey, and that's a good defense against. It's against really Iran mostly, but it is it is NATO. It is a U.S. ally, and this nuclear umbrella from the U.S. Using those nukes can extend over other countries who might also want nukes, right? Because if it weren't for U.S. and NATO, even some non-NATO members might want some nukes for defense against Iran. Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt. Now Israel has nukes already, but it's probably a relatively small arsenal, which is bigger than Iran's, but. Saudi Arabia, Israel, Egypt, and some other countries might be interested in nuclear development without these nukes stationed in Turkey, without this protection of the U.S. nuclear umbrella through Turkey. So if Turkey wasn't a member of NATO, in other words, it could lead to nuclear proliferation, and that's another big sort of asset that those 50 nukes at Incirlik could make much more than just Turkey feel a bit more comfortable with the situation in Iran. All right, potential answers. Once again, good place to pause and think about this. Main thing is just not topical, and so this would be, once again, bringing it back to definitions that we're talking about. Does Turkey itself make NATO itself stronger or weaker? That's the question. We're not talking about hypothetical worlds where Turkey is forced out of NATO or quits NATO or does other things with other countries or forms an alliance with the Martians. Like, maybe those are good questions, but that is not the question that we're talking about now. On Russia specifically, Got20 talks about how the relationship with Russia is shaky. As I mentioned before, the relationship is mainly built on opportunism, on convergent interests, and not on anything like hostile or not on a close, like, warm relationship just based on, hey, like, we can work together in these areas because we both want these things to work for us. Okay. Diplomacy. So this is one of the cards in the evidence pack. NATO is a diplomatic tool. I bet 12 and can lead to de-escalation. So the biggest thing, Got20, is Turkey and Greece. That is really the biggest thing. But as we've talked about before, Turkey has used NATO as a tool to coordinate action in Libya. After, the U.S., France, UK were kind of all going at it individually in Libya. NATO was a great tool that Turkey could use to kind of coordinate all the efforts. So good diplomatic tool for Turkey. Answers to this. Pause. Let's go. Diplomacy. So answers to diplomacy. These are benefits to Turkey. So it's good that Turkey can use NATO for different things, but that's not the same as NATO getting the benefits from Turkey, which is really what our topic is about. Emboldening, this could be, it's sort of a turn, actually. It's sort of saying that because Turkey is in NATO, Turkey feels very confident to do whatever it wants, and that's not actually a good thing. So this kind of tool for diplomacy, it's like maybe they shouldn't be so bold about their adventures around the world, about their support of rebel groups in different countries and their drone bombing of different groups. NATO could make them feel much more comfortable doing this. Now, Turkey is a powerful country with a powerful military, so absent NATO, it's not clear they would act any different, but very well could be. Lastly, let's touch on a couple non-military arguments. So, refugees first. We mentioned that they've taken in a huge amount of refugees. That's World Bank 21. And so, in as far as you want to bring up any kind of like human rights, and this is especially a good sort of rebuttal or counterweight to any con arguments about human rights, right? Maybe they have some suppression of the Kurds, or they have suppression of democracy. Well, you can say, and these are kind of human rights and civil rights things. You can say, hey, they've taken in more refugees than any other country in the world. So, I mean, you can't say, also on balance, I mean, maybe they're really good for human rights, because where else are these people going to go? There's some other evidence, and I don't believe I cut these cards, but it's out there, that many of the refugees in Turkey are also going to stay there long term. So Turkey is sort of trying to figure out a way to best integrate all these people, because that's just the reality. I mean, they're not going to all like leave. Even if the war in Syria ended and we set up like a independent Kurdish state, like there'd still be a bunch of people, a bunch of Syrians in Turkey. Another argument, which is, I had this originally in a bubble called dumb arguments, and then I thought, I don't want to, I didn't have enough dumb arguments essentially to fill up a bubble, but this last one might be kind of dumb. Turkey's European and wants to be part of the EU. It's taken some steps to become an EU member, and so it should also be, it's also a great member of NATO. It doesn't really make any sense actually as an argument, but it is a thing, right? Especially thinking about the EU. The EU is kind of for like visas, and a lot of it is for the economy, for like trade, economic relationships. And so any relationship between Turkey and NATO countries in economic terms would best be thought of as part of something like an EU pact. NATO is not about trade ties. All right, that's what we have for pro. In our brief, and I think in the literature kind of overall, con often seems to have a bit of an advantage in the literature, because once again, people talk about changing the status quo more than they talk about defending the status quo. In many contexts, it's a more interesting thing, I think, to write about, right? Like, especially if you're a journalist and you want to like pique people's interest, you don't want to be like, hey, things are fine, things are good. Like, who wants to read that? So you write about changing the status quo, and that's always con. And I am saying totally that is not true. It is normally pro, talking about changing the status quo. Con here really does seem to have a bit of an advantage, though. It really does. Khan is talking about Turkey not being beneficial to NATO. So I guess when people are talking about changing the status quo between Turkey and NATO for this topic, it would mostly be Khan arguments, right? Talking about like kicking Turkey out of NATO, having them leave NATO, having sanctions towards Turkey. These really are kind of like changing the status quo kind of things, which is for this topic, con. Although not normally. So let's take a look at those things. I really think for pro, once again, the major thing is just the military ally. That's the most topical thing. It's probably the biggest amount of evidence, the biggest number of kind of different contentions you could potentially launch. So these other things, perhaps to a lesser degree, but the military things are going to be the big thing. It'd be great if I knew how Prezi worked. Okay. Now, con. Why is Turkey's membership in NATO not beneficial to NATO. Once again, one potential case summary. One potential case summary, not the only one, but a potential one, might read something like, Turkey is a liability at best, and at worst, it is an actual enemy to NATO interests. Trusting Turkey, an ever closer ally of Russia with NATO military secrets, much less with the nukes the US has stationed there, is a catastrophe waiting to happen. So first on military vulnerability. As you can see, the top three bubbles are really kind of all decent arguments. They're all kind of military related. You know, the middle one is really about the structure of NATO fundamentally. The last one is another dumb arguments bubble, and values could be important. Let's talk about military first. So this is the big thing, the S-400 purchase. Hansen et al. Talks about that. It could enable some information sharing with Russia. So just as far as Russia can get any kind of data from that system, that could help Russia, right? Whether it's intentionally or not intentionally. A quote from Hansen, quote, it would mean at a practical level, Turkey would be isolated from certain things within NATO meetings, exercises, things along those lines, end quote, because NATO doesn't want to share too much information with Turkey if they know that that information can then pass on to the Russians. Within NATO, there's kind of a hierarchy of how much information you get, right? And Turkey might be pushed to the very bottom of that hierarchy. It's a technology mismatch, as we talked about before. It's Apple and Android. It's not compatible with NATO systems, the S-400. But also it's a strategic mismatch, because it's like when you buy these high-tech pieces of equipment, they need to be serviced, maintained, and that's usually done by the country that makes it, right? Like Russia knows how to take care of these systems, right? They're the ones who made them, right? So we'll have like Russian contractors coming to take care of them and maintain them, sell, spare parts, and if they're ever used, maybe you need like more like missiles or something. So the life of time of this equipment is decades, and so that means that Turkey will be needing Russian military support for decades. So when you're purchasing a system like this, you're really setting up a long-term relationship with the country who sold them. It's not just a one and done purchase. It's an ongoing relationship that you're establishing with the purchase. Gürer and Sozer talks more about Russian influence. So this is, if this is not in your case, you're going to hear it in other people's cases, this S-400 dealio. So answer two bubbles, one for S-400, one for Russia. Pause the video, write down your thoughts, or don't. I'm not your mom. For S-400, first, they're not operational. We talked about that before. They're not even deployed yet, right? Second, Turkey wanted to buy systems from NATO, but the U.S. refused to sell the Patriot missile system to Turkey. So they were kind of forced to shop elsewhere. They wanted to buy the U.S. system. And overall, in terms of military sort of equipment and everything, overall, Turkey does prefer NATO purchases. More Yasu and Tavs 21. So it's kind of NATO and the U.S. who pushed who pushed Turkey into a corner and forced them to shop elsewhere and look to the Russians for the purchase. But even after they've done that, look, they haven't deployed the system, so it's not really a threat to NATO interests. And indeed, Turkey has said that they may build their own system because they don't have the one from NATO. They don't have a U.S. system. The U.S. has, I believe, subsequently offered to sell Patriot missiles to Turkey, but it's kind of too little too late, right? They've already bought this Russian system, but the Russian system doesn't work. So they're like, hey, screw you guys. We're going to build our own. And will they do that or not? I don't know. Answer to Russia. There's a Got20, quote, fears of a Russian realignment with Russia are likely overblown. Moscow and Ankara's relations have historically been fraught, and the recent rapprochement stems more from opportunism and coinciding interest than a major reorientation in Turkish foreign policy at the expense of its traditional allies. I'm also realizing right this second, which I should have known, I don't think Istanbul is the capital of Turkey. I think it's Ankara, and I believe I lied to you all. So Istanbul must be major city. Ankara capital. Let me make a note to clarify this in the comments. Okay, notes have been made. Let's talk about division. This is a real killer here. So, there is division between different NATO members, but also between Turkey and NATO a little bit more specifically. Internal and external divisions that Alan Hughes talks about. There are divergent interests between NATO and Turkey. That's Gilsanan 20. And given these divergent interests, there's no cohesive vision. Maybe some cohesive vision on some particular situations, but overall, the vision of Turkey is not the same as the vision of NATO. And so they're not cohesive in that way. One good example is which other allies should they be reaching out to? Turkey is forming its kind of own relations on its own terms with Central Asian countries, Middle Eastern countries, with Russia, with China, whereas the rest of NATO really seeks to reach out to the democracies of the world, to find other countries that share its values rather than, say, its geography. So countries like Japan and Australia, far away, but countries that have similar values because they're strong democracies. Turkey's able to veto plans with NATO, and they have vetoed, I think, a fairly major plan for Poland. So Turkey can kind of get in the way of NATO operations. Erdogan is the really big thing, right? Like, he is, once again, corrupt, anti-democratic, really anti-Western, not on the same page as the rest of NATO. So, like, this man by himself is really the oddball of all NATO countries. Like, of all the internal enemies that NATO has, he is likely enemy number one. NATO also has an over dependence on Turkey. So the flying missions from there, having the nuke station there, and the sort of how they project power from Turkey, this could be overextending itself. Cole et al. 21. Going back to internal and external divisions, some of the internal divisions, once again, things that are internal in Turkey but sow divisions within NATO, is Erdogan's walking back of democracy, of press freedom, civil society, Turkey's incursion into northern Syria, of course. Turkey also believes that NATO doesn't address its security concerns, specifically migration and terrorism. And so a lot of Turkey, quote unquote Turkey, let's say members of the government, perhaps a lot of the people, don't believe that NATO is good for Turkey either. And so if Turkey doesn't want to be a member of NATO, like, better not keep dragging them along. Perhaps cut ties and go your own way, right? External divisions, Russia. That's the big thing. In terms of U.S.-Turkey divisions, this is a quote from Hotfall News 21. Quote, Turkey has, Bandow said, entered into conflicts with Washington's allies, arrested American citizens, colluded with Islamist forces, and targeted Kurds allied with the United States. So, some clear actions from Turkey that are anti-U.S., which once again is kind of the basis of NATO. In terms of overdependence, Turkey's continued... Where are my notes? Turkey's continued tension-filled membership with NATO impacts policy in two meaningful ways. First, as long as Turkey remains in NATO and adheres to the general status quo, it must still be treated like a NATO member. As it stands, the U.S. needs Turkey, but Turkey does not need the U.S. This is according to the Turkish envoy to the United States. The U.S. needs Turkey, but Turkey does not need the U.S. This is all from Cole et al. So let's talk about some of the specific conflict examples we have between Greece and Turkey, of course. There have been, once again, this is just basic geopolitics. Turkey and Greece are neighbors, and their interests don't always coincide. So they've had a lot of historical issues. Also, just nationalist-based issues. They're both very proud of. Greece is proud of the Greeks, and Turkey is proud of the Turks. So some nationalistic things as well. Conflict over natural resources. I think mostly gas. I don't know if there's any like fishing things, but I think it's mostly like petrol things. Tensions could also spark a conflict. So there hasn't been a hot conflict, but it could be sparked. That's Mecum 21. Let me read you a little bit from here. There have been several worrisome incidents over the years. This is from Mecum 21. Among other problems, Turkish military planes continually violate Greek airspace. Athens then sends its fighter planes up to intercept and challenge the Turkish aircraft. In some years, as many as 2,000 times. All it would take is one miscalculation by a Greek or Turkish pilot to trigger a crisis between Athens and Ankara. I definitely lied to you about Istanbul. Not that last part, but crisis between Athens and Ankara, end quote, Mecum 21. So this is a pretty big division within NATO, the Turkish-Greek division, right? And yeah, a house divided cannot stand, right? To have members of your coalition at constant war with each other, even if it's sort of a war of ideas and geography, is not good. Some other things, there's a lot of anti-France sentiments. Anti-U.S. sentiments. A lot of Turks just don't like the U.S. I don't know what the numbers are. That's in Bandow 21, but the numbers are high. France has had a number of issues with Turkey over religious freedom. So, as you know, there's been some big issue about, France is a very liberal country, right? Some might argue it's too liberal. A lot of people would argue it's too liberal. But one of those things is that they have their kind of French flavor of liberalism, is they have a very firm stance on freedom of speech, freedom of religious expression. You should be able to say whatever you want, and they encourage you to say whatever you want. It doesn't matter how many people are angry. So a lot of the Muslim world has been angry at France, at Macron, at the government for encouraging the free express. They see it kind of as like anti-Muslim, because there's a lot of, like, let's say, anti-Muslim people in France, and the French government is like, yeah, say whatever you want. Like, that's one of our values. And so Turkey's had some issues with France over this. Yeah. They've been fairly... one other thing about just politics here is a quote, Turkish public opinion is nationalistic, conspiracy-minded, and even more hostile towards the U.S. Indeed, a recent poll found that 6 out of 10 Turks viewed America as the greatest threat to Turkey, compared to just 19% who fingered Russia. There is the number. 6 out of 10 are anti-U.S. So that's from Bandow 21. So these are some examples of sort of internal conflict. Turkey has some issues with the U.S., with France, with Greece. These are at least a few of the examples, potentially with other countries as well. There's a lot of countries out there. In terms of the actual goals of NATO, Turkey also has not been great. So they've had the operations in Syria that run counter to some of the goals of NATO members like the U.S. Once again, Congressional Research Service 21. They've also contributed to Iranian sanctions busting. So there are very, very heavy sanctions on Iran. Turkey has helped Iran to get around some of those, channeling money, essentially money laundering through Turkey, a lot of Iranian oil money, so that Iran can still have all that money. This is Halkbank from Turkey. They process billions in Iranian oil money, something like 20 billion, including labeling some of the money as like food or medicine so they can escape sanctions labels. For Libya, they've supplied arms to Libya. Once again, this is a NATO operation, but they've been doing some of it illegally. They've been, first against Russian interference in Libya. Russia's trying to build a military base. So this could be kind of a pro-NATO thing. Okay, you're saying they're against Russia, therefore they're for us. But they've also had this issue with, shipping arms illegally. In June, this is another thing with France, actually. In June 2020, there was a French ship that was under NATO command just doing patrols in the Mediterranean, and they stopped a Tanzanian-flagged cargo ship. They suspected this ship was smuggling arms to Libya. It's waving a Tanzanian flag. So there's a French frigate, whatever that means, was kind of trying to do patrols and like inspect this boat. And then there was 3 different Turkish boats that came up and harassed the French ship, like trying to scare them off. They like flashed their lights at the French ship. The crew put on like bulletproof vests. They like manned their guns. And so, yeah, these Turkish ships were kind of like shadowing the Tanzanian flagged ship. And that was kind of suspicious. I don't think the rest of the details about this really came out, but Turkey claimed the boat was carrying humanitarian aid. And so this, was another sort of internal issue between Turkey and France. So a lot of ways that Turkey is really against, in its specific actions, is against NATO missions here. So Turkey, once again, just, in short, is a big wedge between many Turkish countries, or between many NATO countries. It is really bad for NATO cohesion. Some potential answers to this, go ahead and pause if you want. Here's my answers. Turkey's military relationship with NATO remains strong. The Tucker 19 card is great. They're like, yeah, there's a lot of politics going on, but NATO's about military, and the NATO-Turkey relationship is fantastic, and that's what we should be focused on. That's a good card. Got 20. We got so much content from Get. NATO can prevent deep-rooted conflicts, for example, with Greece. So, yeah, there are some divisions. There's always going to be divisions. Like, not all NATO countries are the same. Not all of their interests are the same. They have this one interest, which is, like, defense from Russia, and that they do really well, and that Turkey helps with really well. But, of course, there's going to be other things. Like, you can't just, like, make everyone be, like, Care Bear friends forever and ever just because, like, you're trying to not get invaded by Russia. So perhaps our expectations that all countries be perfectly like happy and at peace and like hold hands with each other when there's 30 of them, perhaps our expectations are wrong here. Like, we should be concentrating on the big picture, which is like, are they a good military alliance? And the answer is yes. I mean, according to Pro, right? That's on division. Next, on nukes. So these are just, I mean, if you know nothing about the situation, it's like, okay, there's 50 nukes in Turkey, and like Turkey is kind of volatile, and they're nukes, and there's not that many soldiers protecting them, not that many U.S. soldiers protecting them. So, I mean, that's just scary, right? And I mean, I think that's sort of like the layman's thoughts if you kind of know the basic things, but there's experts who think the same way. Low C-19, Turkey's too volatile for these nukes, and they could be a liability in several ways. They could be stolen. They could be sort of taken hostage. There is, I don't know which the card is, but there's one of these cards that talks about the nukes being Erdogan's hostages, essentially. Codes could be figured out. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what Brian19 says, and they're probably smarter than me. They're more of an expert. I mean, they're in our evidence, but I don't know if it's really true. I really don't know. I am suspicious about that claim. They could also be repurposed for dirty bombs. That seems, of course, they could be. So that's essentially like, even if you can't detonate the bombs per se, you can use the nuclear material inside and blow that up, and that spreads radiation everywhere. So it's not a nuclear explosion. It's not a thermonuclear explosion. It doesn't have the same power as the nukes themselves, but it could be bad. It could be real bad. Nukes could also be taken out of Turkey, Sapolsky 19. So this is a real dangerous situation we have with a government we just can't predict, right? We just can't predict what this country under the authoritarian leadership of one man is going to do with these nukes. Potential answers. Pause. Play. They're guarded by the U.S. military, NBD. They're also protected by codes, so you can't actually crack the codes. Now, once again, Brian19 says, you can crack the codes, but you can't crack the codes, according to Joel, who knows nothing. So I would look into that if you're going to use that as an argument. Turkey also provides good geography for staging. So who's the major enemy here? Russia and Iran, and not Turkey. And it's really nice to have them like really near to these countries to just kind of remind them, they're here. And the answer to that, of course, is probably ICBMs. The whole idea of ICBMs is you have a missile anywhere in the world and you can shoot a nuke to anywhere in the world. And they're really fast too. Like, you don't even have to worry about like, hey, it would take too long. Like, no, it's like 20 minutes versus like 3 minutes. I don't know what's the difference if you're nuclear bombing a country. So that's another thought. We don't really need them to be stationed in Turkey. We have missiles. We have all of Europe to station them in, first of all. There are nukes in other places like Italy, and so why not just use those? Like Turkey's not like somehow special for this. But I think it could be also symbolic, just to kind of remind Iran who's in charge here. Values. Non-military, but perhaps very important. Very misaligned with NATO countries. Rigged elections, media suppression, all the things we've talked about, suppression of the Uyghurs. Couple specific things. So for democracy, Turkey's lack of democracy disqualifies it from NATO Boot 21. Erdogan is destroying Turkish democracy. Van Dijk and Sloan 20. NATO and Turkey have divergent goals, especially for what other countries to ally with, as we've already discussed. A quote from one of these sources, one of the first two, I believe. I should make my notes better. Quote, NATO's membership action plan, quote, requires candidates to have stable democratic systems, pursue the peaceful settlement of territorial and ethnic disputes, have good relations with their neighbors, show commitment to the rule of law and human rights, establish democratic and civilian control of their armed forces, and have a market economy. So Turkey does have a market economy. It does not have the rest of those things. So the membership action plan is being violated at every turn by Turkey. Answer to this, it's not defense related. It's about democracy. Democracy is cool. That's not the impacts we should be considering here. And then once again, let's separate Erdogan and the country. So just because Erdogan is engaged in democratic backsliding and corruption, it's not the same thing as Turkey being irredeemable. Like, Turkey and the military are great allies, even if Erdogan is not. So let's separate those things out. Some potential answers. Okay. Human rights. Turkey has violated nearly all the norms of NATO members. We've already been over these, but I guess we can separate democracy per se and human rights and civil rights, right? Human rights being like, how are you treating people? Civil rights being like, how are you letting people behave, right? In terms of like accessing information and speaking freely, right? Human rights being like, who are you arresting? How are you treating those prisoners? Like, what kind of conditions are you giving people to live in? So, yeah, we've been over these enough, but this could be a contention. Potential answers to this are, for the Kurds specifically, if you're going to do if you hear like a Kurd argument, like they're a terrorist group, like regardless of the warm fuzzies that a lot of people have in their hearts, they're a terrorist group. I mean, the country that they're hosted in believes they're a terrorist group. And our country, the U.S., also believes they're a terrorist group. And the EU also believes they're a terrorist group. So, are you going to not be fighting a terrorist group? Perhaps it would be irresponsible of Turkey to not defend their territorial integrity, to just let the Kurds do whatever they want. That's not responsible for the government. In terms of human rights, many countries could be accused of human rights violations. I mean, the U.S. is, in terms of pure numbers, a much worse violator of human rights than Turkey. It's my belief that the U.S. is truly a force for good in the world, but in terms of pure numbers, like, the U.S. does a lot of bad stuff too. We could also say it's non-topical. NATO deals with defense, not human rights. We can say it's bad. We can have a lot of things that are bad with Turkey that are not related to NATO. Just keep that in mind. I mean, yeah, like Turkey can be the worst country in the world, but if it's not bad for NATO, if those things it's doing, if it's kicking puppies, but it's not bad for NATO, then like don't include that as an impact. Last couple things. So don't run these. These are not really cases. I actually had some other things you should not run here, but let's stick with these just in case you decide to run them. Kick Turkey out of NATO. That's something that people talk about. Like, because they're so bad for NATO, we should kick them out. There isn't a mechanism in NATO to kick them out. I mean, it doesn't mean it couldn't happen, but there is not a mechanism in place for kicking them out. So they'd have to sort of remove themselves from NATO. That's what some people think. And then, of course, we abolish everything, right? So let's abolish NATO too, right? Let's defund NATO. Maybe NATO has served its purpose. Maybe it just escalates tensions with Russia. Maybe NATO will lead to World War III. Maybe having 30 countries teamed up against one country is really not cool, especially in 2022. We should be trying to de-escalate, de-arm, chill out a little bit, and try all not to die in a nuclear apocalypse. Let's die of climate change instead. You know, it seems a little bit better than dying of nuclear apocalypse. So let's abolish NATO. And if NATO should be abolished, then Turkey shouldn't be a part of it either, because no one should be a part of it. Just some thoughts. These are really more policy things, but doesn't hurt to think in policy terms if y'all are thinking of graduating to policy eventually. Okay, that concludes this lecture. Thank you for watching. Have a beautiful 2022, and please leave a comment with your thoughts about the topic, thoughts about the lecture, thoughts about whatever you're hopeful about for this new year. See you next time. Bye-bye.